On Christmas morning, my daughter asked why she didn't get any gifts. My sister joked, "Maybe Santa skips kids who don't fit in." Everyone laughed. I didn't. I pulled out my phone, made one call, and by day 4, what they found in the driveway made them scream. That Christmas morning, my little girl looked up at me and asked why everyone else had presents except her. And before I could even process it, my sister Karen smirked and said maybe Santa skips kids who don't really fit in, which made the whole room laugh while I stood there stone still, pulled out my phone, made one quiet call, and 4 days later what ended up sitting in their driveway had them screaming. Christmas at my parents' place had never felt warm or joyful. It was always stiff and staged, with matching sweaters nobody chose for themselves, smiles that felt practiced, and gifts wrapped so perfectly they looked more like props than something meant to be enjoyed. But that year I convinced myself things might finally change. My daughter Lily was old enough to actually remember the day, and I wanted her to have at least one decent Christmas memory with her grandparents, even though deep down I should have known better. We arrived just after 8 in the morning, the house already lit up, Christmas music humming through the walls, and Karen's car was parked crooked across 2 spaces like she owned the place, which gave me a headache before I'd even turned the engine off. My son Ben bolted ahead the second we got out, thrilled by the smell of waffles and the excitement of whatever might be waiting under the tree, while Lily stayed close to me, half awake but smiling, wearing the red dress she'd picked out herself and clutching a drawing she'd made for Grandma Ann. She'd spent 2 full days working on it, a picture of the house covered in snow with everyone holding hands in the yard, and she folded it carefully and slid it into her coat pocket like it was something precious. Inside, everything was exactly what I expected, with my dad Frank planted in front of the TV and already deep into his first glass of scotch, my mom greeting us with a stiff hug and a comment about how worn out I looked, and Karen acting surprised to see me even though she'd texted me the night before asking what kind of wine to bring. I'd brought gifts, expensive ones, because I'd learned that money was the grease that kept things from turning ugly, so Frank got noise-canceling headphones, and got a silk scarf she'd once admired, my nephew got a drone, my niece got a bracelet, and Ben got a brand new phone, all of it wrapped neatly with bows I tied myself, which I realize now was pointless. When it came time to open presents, names were called one after another as the pile shrank. Ben's face lit up when he opened his phone. Karen's boyfriend, a guy I'd met exactly once, unwrapped a leather wallet with a gift card tucked inside, and my niece shrieked when she saw her MacBook Air, while I sat quietly waiting for Lily's name to be said. Never happened. She sat there patiently at first, then started looking around the room with confusion on her face, and finally leaned over and whispered to me, barely loud enough to hear, asking why Santa forgot about her. And before I could answer, Karen laughed and said that line about Santa skipping kids who don't fit in. No one pushed back, no one told her to stop, they just laughed, even my mother chuckling softly while holding her scarf like it was all harmless. And that's when Lily's drawing slipped out of her coat pocket and fell to the floor, where it stayed because nobody bothered to pick it up. I stood up without saying a word, walked into the kitchen, pulled out my phone, and made one call to cancel the $8,000 furniture delivery I'd set up for their New Year's remodel, the custom leather sectional, the dining set, every last piece, and then I went back out and waited. For days later my phone rang, and when I answered it was my mother screaming, not about missing furniture but about what had shown up instead: a rusted metal folding chair, a flimsy plastic table from a liquidation warehouse, and a hand-delivered envelope sealed in gold that held a note saying they were officially cut off and needed to find another wallet, signed with my name, and I hung up before she finished yelling, blocked her number. Then my dad's, then Karen's. I didn't explain anything to the kids, I just took them out for ice cream even though it was freezing, let Lily try the claw machine where she won a plush penguin, and she told me it was the best day ever, which made me cry quietly later that night after they were asleep. I knew it wasn't over though, not even close, because they were never the type to let something like that go, and whether they wanted revenge or forgiveness didn't matter to me, but what happened next still crosses my mind sometimes because what they brought to my doorstep wasn't just petty, it was sick, and they never saw my response coming. The silence lasted exactly 10 days with no calls, no texts, no passive-aggressive holiday memes from Karen, and for a brief moment I let myself believe they were ashamed enough to disappear, that maybe the message had landed, but I was wrong. It was a Saturday afternoon in mid-January. The kids were sprawled on the living room floor building a Lego castle, Ben arguing with the instructions while Lily crawled under the couch looking for a missing piece, and I was half listening from the kitchen when a hard, demanding knock slammed against the door, and I knew immediately who it was. When I opened it, my parents stood there like nothing had happened and holding a wrapped gift, Frank with his hands stuffed in his coat pockets, and behind them was Rick, their neighbor, the guy who always smelled like tobacco and gasoline. The same one who'd been making comments about me since my divorce that my parents always brushed off. And shoved the gift straight into Lily's hands before I could stop her and smiled at me like we were on neutral ground. Frank didn't even look at me, and Rick leaned against the porch railing like he was settling in for entertainment. And said family doesn't stay angry forever. Frank muttered that the money issue was behind us, and then gestured toward Rick and said I shouldn't be alone at my age, that it wasn't healthy for a woman, and that Rick was a good man who wouldn't judge my past, while Rick laughed like he'd already been invited inside. I told them to leave but stepped forward into my house instead, glanced around the living room, and commented that it still looked nicely decorated all things considered. And when Frank finally looked at me, it wasn't with regret, not even close. I could feel the irritation rising when my son stepped into the hallway and stopped dead the second he saw Rick standing there. And my daughter froze too, still clutching the gift in her hands, until she slowly opened it and revealed a flimsy coloring book with a bent corner, missing pages and crayon scribbles already covering some of them, the kind you find tossed on a table in a waiting room and never buy on purpose. And she didn't say a word, just stared at it before lifting her eyes to mine, and that look was what finally broke me. I told them all to leave, every single one of them, without yelling or arguing, just repeating it calmly until my mom snapped that I was being dramatic and my dad finally grabbed her arm and steered her toward the door, while Rick hung back, smirking as he said something about me changing my mind someday, and I slammed the door in his face, locked it, slid down against it, and completely lost it for the first time since Christmas. My daughter dropped the coloring book and wrapped herself around me. My son sat down beside us and quietly suggested we leave the house for a bit. Just go anywhere, so we did, heading to the movies where we ate way too much popcorn. Lily fell asleep halfway through, and Ben gently covered her with his hoodie, and for a few hours life almost felt normal again. What I didn't know was that someone else had already heard about the visit, my Uncle Paul, my dad's older brother and the only one who had ever told him no, and he called the next morning asking if I was safe, explaining that my mom had told him what happened expecting sympathy and didn't get it, then invited me to dinner the following weekend, saying everyone would be there and I wouldn't have to say a word if I didn't want to, and before we hung up he told me something that stuck, that they thought they were in control and were about to learn they weren't. I wasn't sure about going and hesitated because I didn't want more drama or another ambush, but Paul promised it wasn't like that and told me to just bring the kids, eat, and listen, though there were surprises, just not the kind I feared, the kind that make you realize someone actually sees you. We arrived a little after 6 on a night so cold the wind felt personal, and I sat in the car for a moment watching relatives I hadn't seen in years filter into the house, distant cousins and people I barely recognized, like a tense-old sitcom scene without the laugh track, and the moment I walked inside I felt it, not judgment or pity but a quiet respect I hadn't felt around family in a long time. Paul hugged me without a word, handed Lily a small toy from a basket, told Ben there was pizza downstairs if he didn't want the fancy food, and motioned toward the packed dining room where my parents sat at the far end, my mom in one of her beaded cardigans and my dad wearing that tight expression he always had when surrounded by people he couldn't control, and none of us said anything. Dinner went on like nothing was wrong, almost too normal, with jokes, travel photos, and incredible food. But there was a thin tension underneath it all, like everyone knew something was coming and didn't want to name it. Until dessert, when my uncle stood up and said he had a short video he wanted us to see. He dimmed the lights and turned on a projector, and the first image was my front porch from the day my parents showed up unannounced with Rick, clearly recorded from across the street by my neighbor at Paul's request after he'd heard rumors they were planning a visit, and everyone watched as my mom handed Lily the wrapped gift. My dad loomed silently, Rick joked about me being single, my mom told me to stop being proud, and I told them to leave. Then the video switched to Christmas morning, Lily asking why Santa forgot her, Karen's voice clear as day saying maybe Santa skips kids who don't fit in, followed by the laughter and the look on my daughter's face, and the room went completely still. Paul turned the lights back on and spoke calmly, saying this wasn't about one argument or a misunderstanding but a pattern of behavior people had ignored for years, that my parents had taken advantage of me financially and repaid it by humiliating my 6-year-old in front of family, and asked if that sounded like love to anyone, and when my mom tried to interrupt he shut her down, telling her she didn't get to spin this and could either listen or leave, so she sat. He talked about how family isn't about blood but about showing up and how you treat people when no one's watching, my father still silent, my sister not even there, and then he turned to me and apologized, not for what they did but for not speaking up sooner, admitting everyone knew and said nothing, and then he looked right at me and said the words I'll never forget, that I'd carried too much for too long, Michelle. He said I'd been the grown-up all along while the so-called adults around me behaved like children, then turned to my parents and told them plainly that from that moment on I didn't owe them a single thing, not my money, not my time, not even my presence, and if they wanted any kind of relationship with me or my kids they were going to have to earn it. My mom stood up and announced she wouldn't stay in a family that ganged up on her. My dad finally opened his mouth and said one word, fine, and they walked out without hugs or goodbyes, but I stayed right where I was. I let Lily finish her pie, watched Ben laughing with cousins downstairs, and for the first time in years I felt like I wasn't shrinking just to survive being in a room full of people. As we were leaving, Uncle Paul pulled me aside and handed me an envelope, telling me this wasn't charity but balance, and inside was a check larger than I expected, enough to finally chip away at the debt I'd quietly built up keeping everyone else comfortable. But what really got me was the note in his handwriting that said I wasn't alone anymore and neither were my kids. And that was the night everything shifted, even though it wasn't the end. My parents don't know how to lose, and sure enough weeks passed with no calls, no messages, no snide online comments from Karen either. Just silence that almost fooled me into thinking they'd finally understood. Except I've learned that when my parents go quiet it usually means they're planning. The first sign showed up on a Thursday evening in the form of a package with no return address but my mom's perfect cursive written across the front, addressed to Lily, and I stared at it for a long time before opening it myself, because something felt off. Inside was a small velvet box and a short letter, and the box held a silver heart locket I recognized immediately because it used to be mine, a gift from my dad when I was 16 and one of the few real ones he ever gave me. Something I thought I'd lost during the move after my divorce but now realized they'd taken. The note inside was cold and simple, saying they wanted Lily to have something of mine and maybe she'd grow up better than I did. No apology, no warmth, just a jab dressed up as a gesture. And I didn't give it to my daughter, I shoved it into a drawer and went to bed with a headache that wouldn't let up. The following week they crossed another line by showing up uninvited at Lily's school, and I got a call from the front office in the middle of a meeting saying her grandparents were there asking to have lunch with her and claiming I'd cleared it, which thankfully I hadn't, so I said absolutely not and drove there so fast I didn't even grab my purse. When I arrived my mom was sitting in the lobby smiling like she belonged there while my dad paced back and forth, and my mom acted surprised to see me, saying they just wanted to see their granddaughter and that family should be allowed to visit and that all of this was my fault anyway. I asked her how she got the locket, and she casually said she found it in a drawer at their house and mentioned they still had some of my things stored away, which made me ask what else they had. And the smile she gave me then told me everything I needed to know, because this wasn't guilt or regret, it was control. My dad didn't say a word until I told them to leave, at which point he accused me of poisoning my kids against them and warned I'd regret it someday when I was alone, while my mom added that children need their grandparents, and I told them they could see my kids someday if they ever learned what respect meant. They left without a fight, but the look they gave me on the way out made my skin crawl, and that night I locked the doors twice and barely slept, knowing something wasn't over yet. 3 days later Uncle Paul called and asked if he could come by alone, and when he arrived he had a flash drive and told me he hadn't planned on showing me this but that I needed to see what they were doing now, then plugged it into my laptop and opened a folder full of screenshots, messages, and emails showing my parents reaching out to relatives and telling them I was unstable, that I'd spiraled since the divorce, that I was using my kids as weapons and emotionally abusing them, all in an attempt to isolate me when they couldn't control me. Paul told me he was done with them, that he'd already cut them off and other relatives were starting to do the same, saying this wasn't a family anymore, at least not the way my parents defined it, and then he looked at me and said they were scared of me now because I'd finally said no, and for the first time I realized he was right. After that flash drive there was no turning back, and I spent days thinking through everything, not just the recent stuff but every holiday I paid for only to be criticized, every birthday they forgot, every insult masked as concern, and it felt like someone finally lifted the lid on a box I'd buried in my mind years ago. I told my kids the truth in a way they could handle, explaining that their grandparents were taking a break from being around us, and Ben just nodded while Lily asked if that meant Santa would remember her next year, and I promised her he would. Then I blocked my parents and Karen again, this time for good, or so I thought, because about a week later my phone rang and it was my friend Rachel on the other end. Rachel works at a local furniture store, the same one where I'd canceled the custom order, and when she called she sounded uneasy as she told me my parents had shown up trying to reinstate the delivery under my name, acting like I'd changed my mind and wanted everything sent again just like before, even bringing a signed letter that was supposed to prove it. Except the signature wasn't even close and looked more like a kid forging a permission slip. Rachel knew immediately something was wrong, refused to process it, and told them I'd have to come in myself, which apparently sent my mom into a full meltdown where she threatened to go to corporate. So Rachel called to warn me in case they tried something else, and when I hung up I wasn't shocked, just bone-tired. A few days later came the part that really knocked the wind out of me, when there was a quiet knock at my door. No yelling this time, no pounding, just a calm, measured knock. And when I looked through the peephole I saw a man I didn't recognize who looked official like a process server, and he handed me an envelope and walked away without saying a word. Inside was a formal notice from my parents' lawyer. Not a lawsuit yet, but close enough, claiming grandparent visitation rights and asking the court to grant them scheduled access to my kids. And I stood there staring at it while Lily played with her dollhouse in the kitchen and Ben worked on homework on the couch, completely unaware of what had just been dropped into our lives. I called Uncle Paul and he was at my house within the hour, reading the letter in silence before telling me they weren't just trying to force their way back in, they were trying to punish me publicly and legally, not because they cared about the kids but because they wanted control. So I hired a lawyer, and then something happened I never would have predicted. One of my mother's old friends, a woman named Darlene who I barely knew, called me and said she felt awful but I needed to hear this, explaining that my mom had been showing people at her church old photos of me from right after my divorce, when I wasn't at my best, telling them I was unstable, that she feared for my children, that I had problems, and that she was quietly building a case against me. And when I hung up I sat at my kitchen table and for the first time in months I didn't cry, yell, or panic. I just made a list. I wrote down every lie, every threat, every manipulation, every time they twisted something to fit their story. And I realized I was done playing defense because my lawyer and I were going to bury this attempt in affidavits, timelines, witnesses, and proof, and thanks to Uncle Paul the first had all of it, but there was one last thing they didn't expect. It arrived before the court date ever did on a Thursday, and I knew the second it hit their porch, not because my parents called but because my uncle did, watching from his car just far enough back to see my dad sign for the package without checking the return label while my mom hovered at the door waiting for him to come inside. Inside that envelope was my final word. A thick packet holding every invoice, every Venmo transfer, every holiday receipt, screenshots of texts demanding money for emergencies, that somehow lined up perfectly with vacations, audio clips they forgot I had, voice memos, bank statements, all dated, organized, and impossible to twist, and right on top was a letter in my handwriting telling them this was the history they chose to forget, now restored, that they could still take me to court if they wanted, but this is what the judge would see, this is what I would say under oath, and this is what everyone would know when it was over. I didn't send it to scare them, I sent it to shut the door. And that night I sat on the porch with Ben while Lily drew chalk hearts on the driveway, watching the stars come out and feeling not victorious or angry but still, which was enough. The next morning my mom called and I let it go to voicemail, then she called again, then my dad, and then nothing, and the day after that Karen sent me a long text saying Mom hadn't stopped crying since the packet arrived, that Dad looked like he'd been punched in the face and that maybe I'd gone too far, but I didn't respond. A few days before the court date, a small white envelope showed up in my mailbox with no return address, just my name, and I opened it right there in the cold to find a handwritten letter from my father saying he didn't recognize himself anymore, that he wasn't proud of what they'd done, that pride had driven every decision, that seeing Lily's face again in that Christmas video finally broke through, that my mom wasn't well and he hadn't stopped her because he was afraid of what choosing my side would mean, and that while he didn't expect forgiveness, he asked me to protect her from them until they earned the right not to be kept away. I read it 3 times, and while it didn't erase anything or pull me back, it hit that quiet place in me that had always wondered if they were capable of seeing it, and the next day my lawyer called to say the hearing had been dropped and the visitation request fully withdrawn, meaning they were backing down. I'd won something more important than a case. I'd protected Lily, kept Ben out of the chaos, and broken the pattern, and Uncle Paul never once said I told you so. He just showed up the next weekend with groceries and fixed the loose hinge on my front door. That summer the 3 of us went away for the first time in years to a little cabin by a lake with no Wi-Fi or TV. Lily bringing chalk even though the driveway was gravel, Ben reading old paperbacks and swimming until his fingers wrinkled, me drinking coffee on the porch at sunrise. And not once did I think about my parents until the last night when Lily looked up from her coloring and said she didn't think Santa skipped her, that he was just waiting, and she was right, he was waiting, and next Christmas they won't forget her name.